Hello and welcome to this TRT World special town hall from New York. I'm Jaffar Hasnain.
I'm Amanda Walker. Today we'll be diving into the big global issues facing the United Nations ahead of its high-stakes General Assembly.
Indeed, and we'll also be looking at the role of the United Nations pressing global challenges and what reforms are needed within the UN.
Now, this year's UNGA sessions come at a time of big strain in global diplomacy. The war in Ukraine, tensions in the Middle East, climate disasters across the globe. We have a panel of distinguished guests who are here to offer their insight on the role that the UN should be playing when it comes to tackling those challenges.
Indeed, and allow me to introduce our first panelist. We have Maria Fernanda Espinosa, the 73rd President of the United Nations General Assembly. Welcome to the program.
And next
I'm
is Vuk
delighted to be here.
Jeremic, the 67th President of the UN General Assembly.
We also have Ambassador Susan Elliott, the CEO and President of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy.
And we also welcome David Roches, who is Associate Professor at the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies. A warm welcome to all of you. And we're also joined by our very informed audience of students from local New York universities, including Columbia and NYU. And we'll be hearing from them throughout the program as they offer their questions to our guests.
All right, I think we are all set. Let's begin the program. Maria, I would like to begin with you. Now, you have often spoken about reforms within the United Nations to make it more representative and more effective. Now, given the current situation in the world with the escalating tensions in the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, in Sudan, be more specific. What specifically do you think the UN should do to change about the way it works?
Well, I think that we have an organization that has almost 80 years of history. And I think the world of today is a very different one. When the UN Charter was signed, it was signed by 50 countries. Now we have an international community and a membership of 193. We have gone from a bipolar, unipolar world, the Cold War era, to a world that is multipolar, more complex, facing different challenges than the ones that we had to face 80 years ago. It means that the institutional structures that we have put together need to be revitalized, rejuvenated. And that means that issues from management to decision making, to the effectiveness to deliver, to connect the decisions that are taken, for example, at the General Assembly, really need to touch the lives and change the lives of people on the ground. And I think that the UN has done incredible good to humanity, but now it needs to be prepared to deal with new forms of war and conflict that is not among nations, for example, transnational organized crime, privatization of security, cyber crimes, the issue of new technologies. You know, all these issues need to be brought into the attention of the United Nations, the climate emergency, and to deploy something that has been the DNA of the United Nations, which is preventive diplomacy. It's not only about ending wars, it's about preventing them.
Okay, let me ask you a follow-up here. A quick personal reflection. Do you think the United Nations is more effective now in comparison to when you were the president of the United Nations General Assembly?
Well, I think every year the scenarios change. Every year the challenges are different. In the past, the world has experienced the COVID-19 pandemic, then the war in Ukraine, the situation, dire situation in the Middle East, almost 100 ongoing armed conflicts in the world today. So I think that the world is becoming increasingly complex, and the response of the international community has to be, you know, at the level and the scale that is needed. And of course, for that you need better policies, more budget for the UN, the institutional structures that are, you know, fit for purpose, more engagement from regions and regional spaces. This is a new form of multilateralism, and of course, engagement of other non-state actors organized civil society, academia, the business sector. I think that the world of today requires collective action, not only from governments, but from society as a whole.
Thank you.
Let's talk about veto power. It's a controversial issue. You've had a front row seat of the inner workings of the UN. Things have changed, obviously, and there's a lot of talk about the ideological gulf between the permanent members. So do you think there is likely reform on the horizon when it comes to veto power?
Well, short answer is no. I don't think that there is a chance in a foreseeable future for this to change. I'm actually very concerned about any reform of the United Nations under the current circumstances, because we now live in a very deep geopolitical recession. And when you are in a recession, it is next to impossible to come to agreement even on some very basic issue, let alone very complex ones. Uh, to, to make it simple, like you can't fix your roof in the middle of a storm. You gotta wait for a better time to be able to fix your roof. So the same is here. Right now, there's very, very little trust between main powers and in general. So before that changes, there is very little hope that the necessary consensus can be reached, and especially on an issue like the Security Council reform. About 8 years ago, I ran for the post of Secretary General of the United Nations, and I had my presentation of my candidacy in front of the plenary of the General Assembly. And a lot of countries asked me about the reform of the Security Council, and that was like a deadly question, because if you say that you're going to support the reform of the Security Council, you're very likely to encounter a veto in the vote for Secretary General. So my answer was like, guys, I think we have only a few years to consider it seriously, because if we don't change it and things continue in this direction, it's going to become infinitely more difficult. And I don't think that under the current circumstances, it's likely at all, to be honest.
So how, when you are in challenging times, how do you end that sense of impotence?
Well, history teaches us that there are like two ways to come to a better situation. One is unfortunately catastrophic. Usually after a big catastrophe, people sit together and finally decide how to work with each other. This is how the United Nations were created in the first place after the Second World War. But right now, given technology that we have and so on and so forth, I'd rather not think about what would that mean in today's circumstances. The other way is to start from something simple. And in my opinion, the most simple, the most fundamental thing is peace. Without peace, and you mentioned some of the wars, but there are many more wars. The main ones, the one that occupy most attention, obviously the war in Ukraine and the war in the Middle East. Before these wars are somehow stopped, there's no way that any kind of discussion in this building or in any other building, in a multilateral setting or any other setting, can yield a result that can yield consensus necessary for moving forward.
Okay, I mean, let me pick up on that. You mentioned peace. Let's talk about peace building efforts, because I believe that's one of the most important tasks of the United Nations. Let me come to you, David, for that one. Now, looking at the current situation in Afghanistan, Sudan, of course, many are questioning UN's peace building efforts. In what ways do you think the UN can improve its peace building efforts given the current circumstances?
Yeah, good question. So historically, the United Nations has been very successful in peacekeeping, which are usually disputes between sovereign countries where there's some sort of a border dispute or something like that, and a settlement comes to place, and then a United Nations forces interpose. They monitor that and verify that. The challenge that we've seen are the rise of failed states, dysfunctional states, or non-state actors who seem to challenge it. And not just the United Nations, everybody is challenged to deal with that. So right now, the largest UN peacekeeping mission is in the Congo. And the Congo has really descended into, it's beyond a failed state. There's a system of factions, a combination of criminality, outer state, other state interference. Not just the United Nations is challenged to deal with that. Sovereign states who have interests are challenged to deal with it. And I think that some people put an unfair burden of expectation. They expect that a guy in a white vehicle with a blue hat shows up and everybody will stand down out of respect for the moral awe of his position. What we need to have is perhaps a more rapidly deployable capability. And what that's going to require is UN member nations to be willing to shoulder more of the burden. Right now, we have an informal system where you have paying countries and you have deploying countries. And that just is not up to this challenge.
I just want to make sure I get this right. So are you indicating that people, the global community, the international community, is expecting more from the United Nations than it can actually do?
They're expecting more from the United Nations than it is actually resourced for. The problem is not the United Nations. The problem are the community of countries that support the United Nations are either not supporting it in the way it needs to be, or they are just not providing the resources, the manpower to do it. We have sort of an informal arrangement where you have a green hat. Countries willing to try to impose peace will stabilize a situation in a failed state until a UN force can be constituted. But we really do need to routinize, professionalize, and improve the peacekeeping operations.
And Susan, I just want to follow on from what Vuk was saying there. Reform is this buzzword, but is now the right time when you look at what's happening in the world?
Well, I think I agree with what he said in terms of in order to do reform, it's hard. I think his analogy is good. If your roof is leaking and it's a terrible storm, it's hard to fix it until the rain stops. So it doesn't mean that reform isn't necessary, but I think even taking on reform of the Security Council, in my opinion, is probably the hardest, the most difficult aspect of any UN reform. And if you look at, I think this is an exciting UN General Assembly this year because after that is the Summit of the Future. And there are lots of areas there. UN Security Council reform is definitely a part of that, but there are lots of other areas in terms of either, peacekeeping, management, ensuring that there's gender equality, women, peace, and security. So there are lots of other areas that the UN, I think, has done a great job and can focus on. But I do think it will be very difficult. I think the Security Council does need reform, but I think, the members, the permanent members, including my own country, the United States, would be very not easily agreeing to expand and give up the veto power.
Will they ever be?
That's a good question. I hope so. I hope so. I want to be, positive, but I think, and given the tensions among the U.S., China and Russia, I think it would be in the near future. I think it would be very difficult to build the kind of trust that would be needed among the permanent members to include others. But I do think, especially expanding the member, even if you had the veto, but having other countries that when the UN was formed were excluded, like Germany, Japan, and other countries really now who African countries who maybe should have play a bigger role. But will it happen in the near future? Probably not. Being realistic, but I say that with disappointment.
Yeah, thank you.
Fascinating insights. Now I think we can open the floor to our esteemed audience. So if you have a question, please stand up, raise your hand, and
Yes, we have
say
a
your name
microphone
and
that we can
institution
pass
you
to you.
represent.
Hello, my name is Eslem. Can you hear me?
Yeah, a bit louder, please.
Hi,
I think it's better.
my name is Eslem, and I'm a student at NYU University. I'm an undergrad student, and I would like to ask you today, after the declaration of International Court of Justice about the occupation going on in Gaza, we couldn't see too many things has been changed in the area. Today, I read something pretty interesting, which is saying UN General Assembly votes for sanctions on Israel for the first time in 42 years. Do you think that this will change something on the area?
Okay.
Maria, should we give that to you? UN sanctions on Israel.
I couldn't follow. I
Okay,
mean,
so
it's
she was
very hard.
basically asking about
You understood, so why
she,
don't you?
I'll jump in and I'll
okay.
give you a very simple answer. Again, it's a no. It's not going to happen. And it's because, again, we're getting to the Security Council. For sanctions actually to be legal and to be binding,
Have to.
it has to be passed by the Security Council. The current composition of the Security Council is such that there is more than one permanent member that is simply going to be opposed to this no matter what happens, because this is the simple politics of the current moment. And I don't expect that this is going to change. So whether this is going to be a big moral um, pointer or a big moral victory, yes. But in the world of realpolitik in which we live, there's no chance for this to pass the Security Council, and there'll be more than one permanent member blocking it.
Hi, hello, my name is Melissa Kelis. I'm a transfer student at Brooklyn College. I'd like to know what the duty of the UN is, and do you feel that the UN is successful in fulfilling its duty at this current time?
Okay, Maria, you would like to take that one?
Yes, sure. The UN Charter was built on three pillars: peace and security, development, and human rights. And basically, the institution was created to avoid war and to ensure that countries live peacefully and that people live with dignity. And I think that you can see the glass half full or half empty. I think that when I said before, the UN has done incredible good. Uh, if you know, just think about a children's vaccination around the world, a first row respondents in situations of calamity or disaster, a humanitarian deployment, all of that is the UN. The Sustainable Development Goals is the UN. You know, the Climate Paris Agreement is the UN. So there are many UNs, and there is a weak UN sometimes that it's unable to respond, unable to do, unable to decide. And that's precisely what we are discussing. It is time for reform. It is time for a transformation of the organization. And I am more optimistic than my colleagues. They said, you know, when there is a storm, you cannot fix the roof. You have to wait until there is calm to fix the roof. The issue is, when is the right time to improve institutions, which are human creations? To say, no, we should wait until the day that there is no polarization, there is no fractures among the big powers, so we can start this. No, it's the other way around. I'm sorry to say that. The UN is the world platform for diplomacy, for dialogue, for international cooperation, and it should remain as that platform. So it's now or never. In now or never, now or never with the voice of future generations and young people involved, now or never with societies, you know, owning the responsibility of making the UN relevant for all.
Come back to the audience again. I just want to enter the second segment of our program. And I think there's one thing that we have already established here. The UN is at a crossroad. And many are questioning whether or not the UN is able to fulfill its main mandate, which is to maintain peace and security in the world. And there's a lot of talk about reforms within the United Nations, within the United Nations Security Council. Vuk, let me come to you. This talk about reforms did not start now. It has been happening for years. In fact, in 2014, the Turkish president said, the world is bigger than five. That was the first time he said it. But the reforms have still not happened. One quick question. What do you think is the biggest stumbling block when it comes to these reforms?
You know what? Like I was chairing the negotiations for 1 year about a Security Council reform, and I was actually doing it myself. Usually, You have a facilitator and you let the facilitator basically do it. Because I really believed that this was a crucial thing, I did it myself. And I can tell you that P5, permanent members of the Security Council, this is Russia, China, France, US, and UK, they're united as one on the issue no to the Security Council reform. Now, some people are reluctant to say it openly, so they sugarcoat it. Some permanent members even say that they are in favor of the Security Council reform. But the truth is, in the room, they're working like one on preventing this from changing. And I honestly don't think this will change. And yes, we are in a paradoxical situation. We are in a situation in which the world's most populous nation, which is India, and the world's largest democracy, is not a member, not a permanent member of the Security Council. That country did not exist in 1945. It was a colony. And the United Kingdom has a permanent seat in the Security Council. For how long is this gonna be sustainable? I don't know. But you know what? Like, unfortunately, I don't see a change coming up anytime soon. But because a lot of people mentioned whether the UN is performing or not performing, right? I heard once someone saying, blaming the UN for not performing well would be just like blaming the management of the Madison Square Garden for the poor performance of New York Knicks. It's not the UN's fault. It is the fault or the glory of the members who make up the United Nations. So I think that the problem is not in the UN. The problem is in the member states who are right now behaving the way they're behaving.
Amanda, I have one quick question for Ambassador Elliott, if you allow. Now, that the U.S. is one of the countries blocking when it comes to reforms within the United Nations Security Council. Now, you have served in the Foreign Service. You have been an ambassador for over 2 decades. I want to ask you, what do you think it would take for the United States to change its thinking about reforms within the UN?
Well, I think going back to what we just mentioned, that the Security Council, even though they disagree on many issues, but they probably all agree that they don't want to give up the veto power. They don't, they're a block in that respect. So I think in order for any country, even the US, to give up or to change the Security Council, they would probably all have to be in agreement, because I don't see the US or Russia or China say, oh yeah, I'll give up my veto power, unless they know the others would do it as well. So I think this is very important thing to see that they may veto different things on different issues, but they probably all agree that that's one thing that they wouldn't give up. But I know we're focused a lot on reform of the Security Council, and I definitely think I would like to see reform on the Security Council, but I do think the UN, the Security Council is at the heart of the UN, but the UN does so many more things that are so important. And even when Anna mentioned, or when Maria mentioned the glass half empty or half full, to me, I look at half full, because there's so many things. And even, the Secretary General, when he took office, looked at and has started talking about reforms, in the area of peace and management and sustainable development. And these are all things, especially in the area of development. And I've worked in a country where the UN Development Program, UNDP, we had every UN agency there, and they really made a big difference in the lives of people. I think I read one statistic that the UN, has changed or affected the lives of over 150 million people. So if we focus on the Security Council, which, yes, I think needs reform, then we can kind of really feel like, oh, the UN doesn't work. But the UN does work in so many other ways that I think it's good to remember that this multilateral forum, and again, how do you resolve conflicts if you don't sit down and talk with one another? Does that mean you're going to fix it? Because it is, I think, this analogy of the countries have to be willing to fix it. But on the other hand, I think talking, I guess, having been a diplomat, talking is much better than, looking for military solutions to problems. So.
Maria, let's discuss some specific changes that are being proposed. You've got the US throwing its weight behind two African nations becoming permanent members. What do you make of that, and what do you make of the timing of that specifically?
Well, first, let me say that when the UN has always been work in progress, reforming parts, bits and pieces. When I was ambassador here at the UN, I remember a three-pillar reform process: the peace and security pillar, the management pillar, and the development pillar. So there was a major restructuring. We've been trying to reform the Security Council for more than 20 years. And when people talk about reform, they immediately go to veto. Veto yes or veto no, and this is going to solve all the problems of the UN. And it's not true. It is really not true. Even if you focus on the reform of the Security Council, it's not about only about membership. It is mostly, according to my experience, no, it's mostly about the working methods of the Security Council. It is about the implementations of the decisions that are supposed to be binding. It is about follow-up mechanisms. It is about a full deployment of preventive diplomacy and peace building. It is about many other things. Of course, the membership matters. It has to reflect the world of today, but the veto power, is part of the working methods of the Security Council. Of course, there are, big politics involved in it, but we cannot think that, the next day, let's assume for a second that we agree there is a resolution and the Security Council is reformed and the membership, the permanent members are expanded to Africa and, countries give up on their veto power, all of that. And the next day, the UN is going to perform in full. It's going to operate perfectly and respond to the current needs. There's so many other challenges. For example, how we govern our ecological commons, how we tackle the climate crisis, how we manage massive displacement caused by, the climate crisis. For example, how we deal with transnational organized crime. I mean, there are so many other issues, and sometimes even when you look at the performance of the UN, people, when there is a veto case at the UN is useless. No. It's really, useless. And the truth is the UN is much more. I said there are many UNs within the UN. And of course, it's very much connected to what Vuk said. It is about the political will of its members.
Let me put it to you, for example, though, if you had African nations represented, the situation in Sudan, for example, would it have reached the level that it has reached, where many people say beyond help? If you had that representation, would that not be the case, perhaps?
Well, you can say the same as Sudan is a pain, in the heart of the international community, and we have a responsibility on what is happening in Sudan. We also have a responsibility on what is happening in Haiti, for example. So the question is, we need a Latin American member, permanent member at the Security Council to solve the problem in Haiti. I am not sure that it's like a straightforward, relationship. Of course, Africa, these 54 nations need to have a voice and be well represented in a body like the Security Council, of course. But it doesn't mean that because of the presence, we would solve Sudan quickly. Yeah, it's more complex than that. And that's why my call is on being more granular when we talk about reform. One of the critical issues for developing countries like my own is to look at the reform of international financial architecture, the Bretton Woods institutions, the money for countries to develop and to have a life with dignity and curb poverty and extreme poverty, to fight racism and discrimination, etc. There are many more things on the table, and I would like to see the UN have this diversity of faces and roles that are enshrined in the Charter.
David, let me bring you in here. from a foreign policy and peace building perspective, what is your vision of the United Nations future? Do you think its foundational structure is still relevant today? Or do you think it needs to adapt to changing power dynamics in the world?
Well, there was a, we often forget this, but the United Nations was founded as a wartime alliance to prosecute a war. The Japanese Empire surrendered to the United Nations on the USS Missouri. And so it evolved over time in a positive direction, I would argue. But there was a flaw at the start, which was the membership of the Permanent Council. By any objective membership, Canada should have had the seat that France offers. Things changed. Now we look at India. For the reasons we've had spoken there, I don't think that will change. And I think it's actually the smaller countries that I think would resist reforming the veto, because by any objective measurement, China, Russia, the United States will always be on the Security Council. But with some of the other countries, you have to wonder, how will it evolve? Part of the reason why reform is so difficult is because there are two parallel arguments at the same time, and they both have the same name, reform. The developing countries the developed countries that contribute most of the funding to the United Nations, when they hear reform, they mean improved business practices, they mean evaluations, they mean metrics, they mean getting more bang for your buck. The lesser developed countries, when they see reform, they talk about increased representation. And so in many ways, we're kind of talking past each other. But at the end of the day, the ultimate value of the United Nations is, whether it's effective or not, at least there is a forum and a common language that can eliminate misunderstanding and misperception that can lead to conflict. The real threat that is negated by the United Nations is not an evil power rising that has to be confronted. That's a political decision that can be neutralized in the United Nations. It's preventing the 1914 scenario where misperceptions and a misunderstanding of one country's positions leads inadvertently to a major conflict that nobody really wants.
Thank you, David. So let's bring in our audience again. Raise your hand if you have a question. Hi. Microphone. Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jake. I'm with the Columbia Journalism School, and as the global landscape changes pretty dramatically with the rise of the far right in a lot of different countries, there's been a lot of back and forth between autocracy and democracy in some of the leading countries in the United Nations. Chief among them, the United States. How does the UN contend with these radical changes in power and domestic policy? And how do you foresee a future with this radical changes and this evolving global landscape of changing power dynamics in the US and abroad, affecting the organization as a whole?
To you, the rise of the far right and the changing political landscape.
Talk about even maybe the changing, I mean, not all countries in the UN, even from the beginning, were democracies. So if a country has changed, and I'd say the country I can think of that had the biggest change in the last century was the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union broke up, and then Russia, and and then the republics became big. So I guess the issue, I think, on this far right issue that you've discussed, that I think would endanger the UN, would be that countries think that the UN isn't effective, and they don't want to be a member of this community. And especially larger countries, whether it's United States, China, Russia, smaller countries, maybe it wouldn't have as big of an effect. So I think that makes, a difference, because I think the UN, does it have flaws? Yes. But, is it a really good way to have and to air differences of opinion, whether it's, you're far to the left, you're far to the right. But I think the danger would be is if countries think, I don't need to be part of this organization, and decide, to leave it. So I would say that would be the threat from this change in maybe how countries look at one another, because at least in my lifetime, whether it's a multilateral organization, multilateralism. I'm a believer in multilateralism, and it doesn't have to be the big organizations like the UN or the EU or NATO. And my organization does a lot of work in Asia, and there are a lot of blocks of countries. Sometimes they call them minilaterals instead of multilaterals, but small, and really can then focus on issues that are in their region. And they don't all have to be, this is another thing, dominated by, and this is maybe one of the unique things about the UN, is that the Security Council has countries that are, it's not all US led, it's not all China led or Russia led. Where if you look at like the BRICS, perhaps there are organizations, or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that China has a bigger influence. And then if you look at other organizations like NATO, maybe the US and the European countries have bigger influence. So I would say, to me, that what you described, the biggest threat is that we would lose multilateral organizations, which I think are really important in maintaining peace and stability around the world.
Okay, all right. Let's take another question from the audience. Who has a question? Right over there.
Hi, my name is Yumna. Can you hear me?
Louder.
I'm with the Columbia Journalism School, and my question was, when we look at the crises engulfing Europe and the Middle East, how can the UN help minimize the global cause and effect of proxy interference in these conflict zones?
Okay, David, I think you should take this one.
Well, honestly, the UN has a mixed record here. So there is a UN force on the ground in South Lebanon right now. It generally just monitors the peacekeeping, and the UN resolutions calling for the withdrawal of Hezbollah north of the Litani River in Lebanon, that doesn't have an enforcement mechanism, and the peacekeeping force there is not really equipped or mandated to force things to work on. So we've seen a problem there. I spoke earlier about how there's this informal arrangement between Green Helmet, where interested nations come in and kind of get involved in actual ongoing military operations, replaced by Blue Helmet, which is the UN that does it. I think that is not an ideal solution, but I think that's just the way we're going. Unfortunately, some solutions, countries just don't want to be the Green Helmet, and the solutions go on and on. So when people in the West talk about UN reform, they're not talking about expanding the Security Council. What they're generally talking about is how can we develop this capacity to do these things. And the wars that we saw in the aftermath of the end of the Cold War have been a challenge to the UN, and I think we're still struggling to see them evolve. The successes are generally, as I said, interstate conflict, the sort of peacekeeping that the UN did prior to the end of the Cold War.
All right. Actually, before we move forward, I have a quick question for the audience. Raise your hands if you still have faith in the United Nations. If you still have faith in the United Nations, raise your hands. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. The majority disagrees, and these are some of the brightest minds studying at some of the best schools in the world. Maria, what kind of message do you think it sends to the international community, the decision makers, the UN Secretary General?
Wow, ouch. That's what I would say. And I basically, I'm an optimist, and I think that trust and hope should drive, the action, especially from younger generations. If I ask you another question, what is the plan B for the United Nations? Should we simply erase the United Nations from, from planet Earth? I don't think that there is an option. And I also think people always speak about the United Nations as an external self-operating machine. We are the United Nations. We have the power and the responsibility to make it deliver better. And these are not just words. I think the issue of participation and ownership when we are talking about reform, it's absolutely critical. And we do not have another global platform to come together and discuss the difficult things. It is the only place. So we have the responsibility to make it work. And even when we vote for a president in a country, I think, young people should ask, what are your plans for the United Nations. We are all part of a global community. It's not only, oh, the governments are not doing the right thing. You know, the UN bureaucrats are not doing the right thing. The first phrase of the UN Charter says, we the peoples of the United Nations. So we are co-responsible. And the UN, as any other institution, is a human creation. So to improve the way the UN delivers, and I agree, when you say reform, the word might mean different things, you know, for different actors. But I think that we all agree that the United Nations needs rejuvenation, needs retooling, needs to be put, you know, up to date to the current reality that we live in. But I don't think that we have the right to just say the UN, finito, close the door and just drop the key.
Well, and that's
Because
what I would follow up with. For those of you who don't think that the UN is relevant, do you have a different idea of something that could maybe bring peace, development, and stability that would be different? And I guess you're the future. And so what I'd like to see is, rather than having young people say it's not relevant, it's no good, you know, come up with ideas to do the reforms. We're all, you know, you're the next generation, and what I would hope that you'll be thinking of, and I'm glad you're here today, is you're thinking of ways that you could participate, whether it's voting in your own country but in helping to come up with ideas that can make the UN better.
Well, let's hear from our audience. Is there anyone who would like to offer their reason for why they don't have that faith in the UN? Go ahead.
Well, I think that one of the main issues for our generation right now is the conflict in the Middle East, and I see, and I know that there was a resolution passed earlier this year for a ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war, but we still don't have a ceasefire, and I think that frustrates me and a lot of people in the U.S. and our generation across the world, quite frankly. And I think that's making a lot of people lose faith in the UN and its effectiveness in dealing with these conflicts and these rogue actors like Benjamin Netanyahu and other leaders in the conflict that won't listen to the norms of the UN that have been established.
I mean, that is a huge issue for a lot of people. You have this body that is supposed to maintain a level of world order, and in that world you have these wars that are raging unchecked. That's a big problem for a lot of people. How do you answer that, Vuk?
I'm so glad that I'm no longer in diplomacy. I'm just a simple professor of international relations. So I remember times being you know, more diplomatic in answering questions. I really don't think it's the UN's fault what you raised. I mean, I understand the disappointment. I understand where it comes from, but it's very simple. It's one permanent member. I mean, more than one, but one permanent member is in the lead, and it's nothing to do with the UN. It's to do with that one permanent member that has very complicated domestic politics, about to get worse. And I'm not surprised that the majority is pessimistic.
All right, fascinating insights. David, I have a question. I just want to pick up on one thing there. Of course, there is this lack of faith in the United Nations, quite prevalent. We did a small poll with our audience, and I've read multiple polls. People have lost faith in the UN. Now, we're sitting here in New York. I wonder, to what extent do you think responsibility of this lack in faith in the UN can be attributed to countries like the United States?
So I was in the Pentagon during the George W. Bush administration when Donald Rumsfeld was Secretary of Defense, and I was responsible for peacekeeping. I was the Deputy Director for peacekeeping, and that made me sort of an informal representative of the UN in the Pentagon. And I can tell you that this was an organization, the leadership was ideologically hostile to some of the things coming out of the UN, but they supported the UN because they recognized the interests that it represents. And I find, I don't want to diminish this, but a lot of people have an exaggerated opinion of what the UN is. They think it's the Justice League. They think it's has the ability to enforce things. So you're unhappy with the lack of enforcement or the lack of passing binding resolutions restricting Israel. I can tell you others are unhappy with the previous mentioned resolution calling for Hezbollah to withdraw north of the Litani River, or the resolution that has called for the cessation of shipments of weapons to the Houthis in Yemen, or any number of, or the resolutions that have been vetoed stopping the use of chemical weapons by Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Those things are noble, laudable goals, perhaps, but the United Nations is a gathering of countries, and countries are going to pursue their own interests. But the fact that you're raising this and that you're drawing on the very name of the United Nations as a source of moral authority for the policy position that you're advocating shows some of the power of the United Nations. People don't call on the moral authority of the local Elks Club or, a sewing circle. They do call on the United Nations. And the fact that you're invoking its duty in there implies that there's a moral authority that should have sway in international negotiations and policy. And that in itself is an important thing that would be lacking absent the UN. So I would urge you to, not expect too much, but to demand a lot. And you'll find the world that you'll grow up in will be a better world than the world that I grew up in, I hope.
Fingers crossed. Yeah.
Maria, I'd like to pivot to the nuclear threat. It feels like things are particularly precarious at the moment. We've got Russia saber rattling, Iran developing its program, North Korea, an ongoing issue. What role does the UN play in that, especially when you have Russia in the Security Council?
Well, that's one of the things that the UN has done, in a very systematic way. And the disarmament agenda, the nuclear agenda, the international legal instruments like the TNP, the Treaty of Non-Proliferation Treaty, and now the new treaty on the total elimination of nuclear weapons. So it has the UN. That's one of the homeworks that the UN has is the kitchen, the laboratory for international law. And I again would recall the issue of the moral authority. We have the international law instruments first that are out there and that need to be complied with. But the issue of the moral authority of the UN, I think, is also worth noticing that we are experiencing and living a nuclear threat. I would say yes. That it's dangerous for humanity, yes. And yet again, the issue of détente and entente. Sorry about the French words, but that's also a role for the UN. Again, to provide a platform for dialogue. The UN was instrumental in the nuclear deal in Iran, for example, the negotiations in Switzerland when they happened. So, when we say UN, it's an abstraction, but at the end of the day, as a collective, as an institution, it does deliver on these issues. It does provide the international law umbrellas that allow humanity to discuss and protect themselves, for example, against a nuclear threat, which is a real threat. It's not a futuristic science fiction issue. It is here. It is dangerous, and we should, do something about it.
Okay, now before we enter the last part of our discussion, I have a question which I think is of paramount importance for our young audience. It's about artificial intelligence, AI. Vuk, this one is for you. The UN has been advised to take the lead on governance of AI. Where to start with that? How would it do that?
Again, I'm going to try and be very simple. For as long as US and China are in direct competition, the way they are right now in most fields, including in the field of artificial intelligence, there can be hardly any progress in meaningfully structuring how you want to regulate this very, very rapidly advancing technology. So we go back to geopolitics. It's difficult to work together if you are in a relation of zero trust between the major powers. When we were talking about the war, peace, nuclear, we had Russia and the West in mind. When it comes to the AI, it is China and the US first and foremost. Under the current circumstances, very difficult to imagine progress. And I'm following, of course, what is there in the Back to the Future and what is being negotiated here in the UN. And I think that the language, which they are now seem to have agreed on when it comes to technologies and artificial intelligence, is actually a very smart language. And I think if it's adopted, it's going to be a great progress. But then again, if there is no peace in the world, which is a prerequisite for building trust, everything that is adopted is just going to stay a dead word on a piece of paper. And there, I'm afraid that I'm the majority.
A final question that I want to put to all of you briefly. We know that former UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld once said that the United Nations was not created in order to bring us heaven, but in order to save us from hell. In its current state, can the UN save us from hell, David?
Well, I always say everybody gets the hell they deserve. I think that the organization itself cannot save us, but if we're going to steer away from hell, that's probably the ship we got to be in.
I mean, I would say, yeah, I would say it can save us from hell because I'm an optimistic person. And even going back to your points, I mean, in a lot of the things that you look at, and I would encourage you to look at what the UN is proposing this year, you know, to have the Summit of the Future, elimination of poverty. I mean, a lot of the things that the UN has done that to me are its greatest achievements are maybe not solving war. Yes, they want to have peace, but in the development world. And as I said, just from my personal experience and having been an ambassador in a developing country and seeing the positive impact that the UN had, can everything be solved and we live in a utopia and not live in a world that's hell? Maybe not, but you know, if we don't try, we'll never succeed. So I'm an optimist and even on the AI question, you talk about the problems between US and China. Why not try to have a dialogue? And it could be hosted by the UN or it could be hosted, my organization does informal dialogues between the US and China. And we talk about a lot of issues. Do we agree? Are we the governments? No, but we can make recommendations that the people from both of our countries agree to. So,
Well, the UN save us from
I'm
hell?
I'm a little bit pessimistic. I'm a bit pessimistic. It's kind of hard to imagine fruitful discussions at a time when barriers to trade are getting higher between the US and China, especially in technology.
I wanted to say that. So I work outside of the US government.
But perhaps this is going to surprise you because at
Yeah,
the end of the
yeah.
day, I'm going to say
Yeah, we have
that
51 seconds.
I think in the UN, I mean, it can save us from hell.
I agree.
Because nothing else can save us. Is it going to save us from hell? It's going to depend on the member states. But if anything can save us, it will be the
I
United
agree.
Nations.
Yes, I would say the question is, would we be better off without the UN? I don't think so. We need the UN. We need a space for collective action, for international cooperation, and a space and a platform to process dissent. I really think we need the UN, and of course we need a better UN, and that's a shared responsibility.
Maria, I'll have to give you the last word. Unfortunately, we are out of time, and I think one thing is clear that in the days ahead, the United Nations world leaders will be discussing reforms within the UN. They'll be discussing human rights and how to bring about peace to the world. Once again, thank you very much to our distinguished panelists and our audience. I'm Jaffar Hasnain.
Amanda Walker, thanks so much for joining us.